Welcome to the program, An Injustice at Greenbush Cantonment, the Execution of a Soldier, War of 1812. I am Bobby Reno, the Town of East Greenbush historian, and I will be the narrator for this program. The War of 1812 between Great Britain and the United States was not a very popular war. It was called Madison's War. Why did the war start? Well, briefly, British ships were attacking American vessels on the high seas, and the British were not ready to recognize American rights at sea. These repeated conflicts on the sea led to the War of 1812 between the two countries. A brief history of the Greenbush Cantonment. The Greenbush Cantonment was the headquarters for the American Army Division of the North. It quartered over 4,000 men. A cantonment is a military training complex. In 1812, General Dearborn, pictured on the lower left of the screen, of the U.S. Army, acting as an agent for the U.S. government, purchased the land from Stephen Van Rensselaer, consisting of 400 acres where the cantonment would be constructed. Now, why was the site chosen? Because it was halfway between New York City and Canada, where the British were headquartered, and it was also near the Hudson River. This is a map drawn by the late Jesse Cunningham showing the layout of the Greenbush Cantonment. The buildings consisted of 8 barracks for enlisted men, 252 feet long and 22 feet wide and 2 stories high. These were arranged 4 on a side, facing the parade grounds. 3 officers' quarters, each 90 feet long, 22 feet wide, and 2 stories high, arranged at right angles, facing the parade grounds. Red Mill School sits where the parade grounds were. Only one building remains, one that used to be an officer's quarters. To the north stood 2 large commissary storehouses and the barrack master's house. To the east stood the brick arsenal. On top of the hill overlooking the whole complex stood the general's quarters, along with the hospital and surgeon's quarters. Around the grounds stood several smaller buildings, such as the guardhouse, cooking houses, medicine shops, and horse stables, all painted white. A light-hearted note in the history of the cantonment was regarding Samuel Wilson, pictured on the left. Samuel Wilson, as you may know, was a meat packer from Troy who delivered from time to time a shipment of beef to the camp at Greenbush, where the soldiers from Troy designated it as Uncle Sam's, implying that it was furnished by Samuel Wilson, who they and other people of the Troy area were accustomed to calling Uncle Sam. The other recruits, thinking that the term was applied to the letters U.S. that was stamped on the barrels of the beef by the government inspectors, began using the name Uncle Sam figuratively for the United States. So Uncle Sam was born at Greenbush Cantonment. And after the war, when the War of 1812 ended, only a few troops remained at Greenbush Cantonment until May the 2nd of 1831, when the U.S. government sold the land to Hawthorne McCulloch. In 1843, the land was divided into 2 parts. One part sold by Hawthorne McCulloch to his son William A. McCulloch, who built Hawthorne Den, which still stands today. Hawthorne Den was made from the materials from the demolition of the cantonment buildings. Another building, built in East Greenbush from the demolition materials of the cantonment, was the Greenbush and Schodack Academy that was located on what is now Columbia Turnpike, near where the Greenbush Reformed Church is today. That school was built in 1831 and destroyed by a fire in 1915. This is the remaining building of the Greenbush Cantonment. It is now a well-maintained private residence. This is a key to the cantonment buildings on a map that was drawn up by the late Jesse Cunningham. The red arrow points to where the remaining building and officers' quarters that is now a private residence is located. The picture is Red Mill School, and as you can see, the Red Mill School now sits where the parade grounds were. This is a photocopy of a painting of the Greenbush Cantonment. This painting is missing. The last history that I could find of it was that it had been on display at the Albany Institute of History and Art. When I contacted them, they had no record of it. The arrows pointing will show the different buildings. The blue arrow, the general's quarters, and the field officer's quarters. The red arrow points to the flagstaff that you can just barely see. The yellow arrow is the Surgeon General and physician's quarters. The green arrow is the hospital. The white arrows point to the officers' quarters. There were 2 on the left side and 1 on the right side. The blue arrow points to where 3 trees was marked on the map, but of course there's no trees there in the painting. The white starbursts are the soldiers' quarters, 4 on a side. This is the painting without all the arrows, and I'll let you look at it for a few moments. This is an etching that shows the back of the remaining building today that is an officer's quarters, now a private residence. The red arrow depicts where that is now. The blue arrow depicts one of the remaining soldiers' quarters. And if you will note, there are no buildings up on top of the hill, nor are there any 3 trees. In 2009, when I had retired from my state job, I was approached by the town of East Greenbush and asked if I would like to work the polls during one of the elections and earn some extra money. I said yes. I was assigned to work at Red Mill School, and I worked with Waldy Cavanaugh, who was the then town historian. Because we were on the grounds of what had been the cantonment in Red Mill School, we started talking about the cantonment and the history of it. And she told me about an execution that had happened during the War of 1812 at the cantonment. She mentioned a soldier that had left his post to check on the well-being of his family and that he returned, but they executed him as a deserter. I asked her, well, if he had returned, he wasn't a deserter, why did they execute him? She didn't know. We both agreed it was a sad story. And basically, I forgot about it until about a month later when I was researching something else and I came upon a first-hand account of the execution. Now, there are no names. This was literally a cold case for me. No names were mentioned at all. But when I read it, I felt something was wrong. I'm going to take a few minutes now and read this to you. This is the first-hand account, and the very first thing that the document that I saw and read that put me on this journey to find justice for this soldier. Some historians had felt this might be a fiction, that because there's no names and there's no author known of it, that it might have been a propaganda for anti-war. It may never have happened. But I continued my research after reading this. In 1813, I was stationed with a detachment of the United States troops at Greenbush in the state of New York. One morning, several prisoners confined in the Provost's guardhouse were brought out to hear the sentence which a court-martial had annexed to their delinquencies read on parade. Their appearance indicated that their lot had already been sufficiently hard. Some were marks of long confinement, and on all the severity of the prison house had enstamped its impressions. They looked dejected at this public exposure, and anxious to learn their fate. I had never seen the face of any of them before, and only knew that a single one of them had been adjudged to death. Soon as their names were called and their sentences pronounced, I discerned by his agony and gestures the miserable man on whom that sentence was to fall, a man in the bloom of youth and the fullness of health and vigor. Prompted by feelings of pity, I called the next morning to see him in prison. There, chained by the leg to a beam of the guardhouse, he was reading the Bible, trying to prepare himself, as he said, for the fatal hour. I learned from him the circumstances of his case. He was the father of a family, having a wife and 3 young children 30 or 40 miles from the camp. His crime was desertion, of which he had been 3 times guilty. His only object in leaving the camp in the last instance was to visit his wife and children. Having seen that all was well with them, it was his intention to return. But whatever was his intention, he was a deserter, and as such taken and brought into the camp, manacled and under guard of his fellow soldiers. The time between the sentence and his execution was brief. The authority in whom alone was vested the power of reprieve or pardon, distant. Thus he had no hope, and only requested the attendance of a minister of the gospel and permission to see his wife and children. The first part of his request was granted, but whether he was permitted or not to see his family, I do not now remember. Dreading the hour of his execution, I resolved, if possible, to avoid being present at the scene. But the commander of the post, Colonel L., sent me an express order to attend, that, agreeable to the usage of the army, I might, in my official capacity as surgeon, see the sentence finally executed. The poor fellow was taken from the guardhouse to be escorted to the fatal spot. Before him was his coffin, a box of rough pine boards, borne on the shoulders of 2 men. The prisoner stood with his arms pinioned between 2 clergymen. A white cotton gown or winding sheet reached to his feet. It was trimmed with black, and had attached to it over the place of the real heart the black image of a heart, the mark at which the executioners were to aim. On his head was a cap of white, also trimmed with black. His countenance was blanched to the hue of his winding sheet, and his frame trembled with agony. He seemed resolved, however, to suffer like a soldier. Behind him were a number of prisoners, confined for various offenses. Next to them was a strong guard of soldiers, with fixed bayonets and loaded muskets. My station was in the rear of the whole. Our procession was formed, and with much feeling and low voices on the part of the officers, we moved forward with slow and measured steps to the tune of the Death March, played with muffled drums and mourning fifes. The scene was solemn beyond the powers of description. a man in the vigor of life walking to the tune of his own death march, clothed in his burial robes, surrounded by friends assembled to perform the last sad offices of affection, and to weep over him in the last sad hour. No, not by these, but by soldiers with bristling bayonets and loaded muskets, urged by stern command to do the violence of death to a fellow officer. As he surveys the multitude, he beholds no look of tenderness, no tear of sensibility. He hears no plaint of grief. All is stern as the iron rigor of the law which decrees his death. Amid reflections like these, we arrived at the place of execution, a large open field in whose center a heap of earth, freshly thrown up, marked the spot of the deserter's grave. On this field the whole force of then at the cantonment, amounting to many hundred men, was drawn up in the form of a hollow square, with the side beyond the grave vacant. The executioners, 8 in number, had been drawn by lot. No soldier would volunteer for such a duty. Their muskets had been charged by the officers of the day, 7 of them with ball, the 8th with powder alone. Thus prepared, they were placed together, and each executioner takes his choice. Thus each may believe he has the blank cartridge, and therefore has no hand in the death of his brother soldier, striking indications of the nature of the service. The coffin was placed parallel with the grave, and about 2 feet distant. In the intervening space the prisoner was directed to stand. He desired permission to say a word to his fellow soldiers, and thus standing between his coffin and his grave, warned them against desertion, continuing to speak until the officer on duty, with his watch in his hand, announced to him in a low voice, 2 o'clock, your last moment is at hand. You must kneel upon your coffin. This done, the officer drew down the white cap so as to cover the eyes and most of the face of the prisoner, still continuing to speak in a hurried, loud, and agitated voice. The kneeling was the signal for the executioners to advance. They had before, to avoid being distinguished by the prisoner, stood intermingled with the soldiers who formed the line. They now came forward, marching abreast, took their stand a little to the left, about 2 rods distant from their living mark. The officer raised his sword. At this signal the executioners took aim. He then gave a blow on the drum, which was at hand. The executioners all fired at the same instant. The miserable man, with a horrid scream, leapt from the earth and fell between his coffin and his grave. The sergeant of the guard, a moment after, shot him through the head, with a musket reserved for this purpose, in case the executioners failed to produce instant death. The sergeant, from motives of humanity, held the muzzle of his musket near the head, so near that the cap took fire, and the body lay upon the face, the head emitting the mingled fumes of burning cotton and burning hair. O war, dreadful even in thy tenderness, horrible in thy compassion! I was desired to perform my part of the ceremony, and placing my hand where just before the pulse beat full and life flowed warm, and finding no symptom of either, I affirmed, he is dead. The line then marched by the body, as it lay upon the earth, the head still smoking, that every man might behold for himself the fate of a deserter. Thus far all had been dreadful, indeed, but solemn, as it became the sending of a spirit to its dread account. But now the scene changes. The whole band struck up with an uncommon animation our national air, Yankee Doodle, and to its lively measures we hurried back to our parade ground. Having been dismissed, the commander of the post sent an invitation to all the officers to meet at his quarters, whither we repaired, and were treated to a glass of gin and water. Thus this melancholy tragedy ended in what seemed a little better than a farce, a fair specimen, the former of a dead severity, the latter of moral sensibilities which prevail in camp. That is the first piece that I read regarding this execution. And like I said, no names. What bothered me about that first-hand account was the soldier stating that he intended to return and that he had done so twice before. I began to ask myself, was this soldier AWOL and not a deserter? And then I asked, what is the difference between AWOL and desertion? Like most people, I thought, if you're gone more than 30 days, you're a deserter. But this is not the case. So I began researching military law, and this is what I found out. I've highlighted the important part in red. Actually, if a service member had intended to return to military duty and control at some point, this person would be tried under Article 86, AWOL, and not as a deserter. This is true even if the person remained absent for 20 years or more. The prosecutor in such a case must prove that the service member intended to stay absent permanently. Now, of course, there was important duty and unimportant duty regarding desertion. And important duty would be, of course, battlefields and combat deployment. But unimportant duty was training, maneuvers, guard duty, and other activity like that. So AWOL, did it exist back in the War of 1812? That was my next question. Again, highlighting and focusing on the first-hand account where the soldier stated it was his intention to return. One thing that I have learned when doing historical research is to tell everyone of your research, whether they're interested or not. Tell everyone, because you don't know who knows what. When I started to do this, of course, I told my cousin Bob Reno about this research, and he actually sent me a document that he had uncovered of men who were charged with desertion from Greenbush Cantonment, and the warrants were signed by Colonel L. Bob gave me my first name, Colonel Simon Larned. And from that, I started to research some of the letters from Colonel Simon Larned, looking for the soldier's name. Pat Riley Perella, who used to live in East Greenbush, he now lives in Florida, is doing her master's thesis on Citizen Edmund Genet. She called me a few years ago to come up and look at the Greenbush Cemetery, the Genet graves that are there. I met her there, and when we finished the business of the Genet graves, I told her about the research into this executed soldier and that I was looking for his name. She said to me, well, I will keep my eyes open. Pat went back to Florida. I think it was more than a year when I heard from her again. And she sent me an email with the subject line, Eureka. I think every historian loves to have a eureka moment. I opened her email. In her research of Citizen Edmund Genet, she found these 3 volumes by General James Wilkinson called Excerpts from Memoirs of My Own Times. And in volume 1, on page 550, was a chapter on the illegal court-martial at Greenbush Cantonment. This research took another turn. I began researching Colonel Simon Larned. The document that my cousin Bob had sent me, I researched the names of each man who was charged with desertion. None of them were executed. So I began to go online to find any documents on Colonel Simon Larned, and I found a few. But the volume that Pat Riley Perella sent me on this illegal court-martial at Greenbush Cantonment contained valuable information and actually gave me the answer that I was seeking. These are excerpts that Colonel James Wilkinson had transcribed from letters regarding Colonel Simon Larned. And he starts out by saying, "My judgment deceives me, and I am badly advised if the following documents will not support the case of the illegal execution of a soldier sanctioned by President Madison after due deliberation in the face of the Constitution and laws." This is a letter from the Adjutant General to Colonel Simon Larned, dated the 29th of January, 1814. I highlighted in red the pertinent sentences of this letter. "Proceeding of a court-martial held at Greenbush Cantonment by your order of the 21st of July, 1813, are illegal, as you had no authority at that time to initiate a general courts-martial." This is Colonel Simon Larned's reply to the Adjutant General, dated February 9, 1814. "Sir, I had the honor to receive your favor of the 29th January, by which I am informed the proceedings of the court-martial ordered by me in July last are illegal, a doctrine new to me, and as far as I have erred, it has been in pursuing the practice of my superiors. While General Chandler was at Burlington, Colonel Pike, afterwards General Pike, at Pittsburgh, and each ordered general courts-martial, approved or disapproved the sentence, and carried them into execution. General Dearborn at the same time commanded at Greenbush. Some officers above my rank passed through Albany in the course of the summer without my knowledge, none giving me any orders. When General Hampton passed through Albany on his way to the frontiers, he refused to give me orders on any subject. This being a kind of deposit for all sick, invalids, rogues, and deserters, the latter increased upon me to an alarming degree. I appointed general courts-martial, approved and disapproved their sentences, and carried them into effect. One man only was shot for repeated desertion, according to the sentence of the court. In all this, I not only conceived that I was doing my duty, but a service to my country. It seems, however, I misjudged." And note that this letter confirmed that there was an execution, so the first-hand account, in my opinion, was not a fiction. Colonel Simon Larned ended his letter by stating, "It would be useless for me to attempt the enumeration of evils resulting from an unqualified decision of the illegality of those general courts-martial which were ordered by me. Those under sentence must be released, and I left to make my peace with them. The charge of murder, for the one who was shot, would be in active circulation immediately." Then came the Eureka letter. Now this letter was dated March the 2nd, 1815, and the years kind of jump ahead a little bit, indicating that there was an ongoing investigation. And I'll get to that later. But this was the letter that was important. This was from Major Asia B. Sizer. Sir, in reply to your letter of this date, I have the honor to inform you that I was a member of a general court-martial, of which Lieutenant Colonel Young was the president, ordered at Greenbush by Colonel Larned in July 1813, at which Lieutenant Cobb, keep Lieutenant Cobb in mind here, Lieutenant Cobb of the Light Artillery and Lieutenant Blauvelt of the 13th Infantry were dismissed the service. Lieutenant Curtis of the 15th Infantry suspended for a limited time, and Samuel Helms, a private, of what regiment I do not recollect, sentenced to be shot for desertion. All of which sentences were approved by the commanding officer and carried into execution. Not having papers with me by which I can refresh my memory, I am unable to give you the precise dates, but I know the sentences were approved and promulgated immediately after the proceedings were handed over by the judge advocate. Helms was executed in the latter part of August or the first part of September following. I was officer of the day and superintended his execution. This was the letter, after 4.5 years of research, that gave me the name of the soldier, Samuel Helms, a private. Then this letter from the Adjutant General to Colonel Simon Larned, providing another twist in this research, dated March the 9th, 1814. President has decided that Greenbush be considered a separate command, so far as relates to court-martial hitherto held. This decision, you will observe, is a confirmation of the several sentences of general courts-martial held under your orders, and will render unnecessary any further proceedings in the cases of Lieutenants Cobb, Blauvelt, and others. In other words, President Madison had decided that the court-martial held at Greenbush Cantonment was legal. This is what prompted Lieutenant James Cobb to fight this sentence. In my research on Private Samuel Helms, I have found very little records, such as his enlistment in the military, or even of the court-martial of his trial, if that even existed. I contacted the National Archives, and they have a whole division down there regarding records of court-martials. I gave them the date of the court-martial, the name of all the soldiers that were tried along with Private Samuel Helms, and they came back to me with the records jumped right over that date. They said apparently someone else in the past was interested in this court-martial. They directed me then to the Congressional Archives, and I found records of James Cobb's fight against his sentence with this court-martial. I'm of the opinion that Samuel Helms was brought to the cantonment under arrest, that he was actually arrested down in Ulster County. He was brought up to Greenbush Cantonment and placed in the guardhouse awaiting his trial. I uncovered a muster roll that shows Private Samuel Helms was AWOL, and that will come up in the next slide. This is Private Samuel Helms's muster roll that was dated October the 22nd, 1812. On it, he was listed as absent without leave on October 2nd, 1812. But on there, someone had crossed off absent without leave and put a notation, soldier on roll, indicating that Private Samuel Helms had returned on October 22nd, 1812. President Madison's decision that the court-martial was legal caused Lieutenant James Cobb to fight his sentence all the way to the United States Congress. Lieutenant Cobb was a West Point graduate. He was a man who had wanted to make the military his career. He was charged with conduct unbecoming an officer. Apparently, he was upset over what he thought being bypassed for a promotion, and he broke his sword over his knee. For that, he was court-martialed and dismissed the service, robbing him of his military career. From what I could find out about his life afterwards, he became an educator and was quite successful at it. But he decided to fight this sentence. On December 23rd of 1829, a report by Mr. Drayton from the Committee on Military Affairs reported, in part, from the foregoing statement, it results that the only question existing in the memorialist, who was Lieutenant Cobb, case is whether an approval by the President of a sentence of a court illegally constituted and destitute of jurisdiction can render that sentence valid. The committee are unanimously of the opinion it could not. Congress ruled the court-martial and the sentences illegal. What Congress was basically stating is that the President cannot make an illegal entity legal. I believe my research has proven that Private Samuel Helms was wrongfully charged with desertion, he was AWOL, and he was tried by an illegal court-martial and illegally executed. I'm now on a mission to change Private Samuel Helms's military record to clear desertion from his name. In March of 2015, I filled out an application for correction of military record under the provisions of Title 10, U.S. Code, Section 1552, and I mailed it to the Army Boards of Review in Arlington. This is a copy of the form that I filled out. I know it's kind of hard to read, but down below, just above where the signature is, there are these boxes. Boxes for spouse, widow, widower, next of kin, legal representative, and other. I checked other and marked historian. I sent this down with all of my supporting documents, quite a large packet, and it hit an intake clerk. She emailed me and indicated that I needed to send documents such as a marriage certificate, death certificate, or the power of attorney signed by the soldier. She left her phone number. I called her, and we actually had a pleasant conversation. She said to me, "Are you his widow?" And I told her, I said, "I'm old, but I'm not that old. He's been dead for over 200 years. "Oh my," she said, "I didn't even look further. You need to provide us with those forms." I said, "I can't provide you with those forms because they didn't exist then." So I have wound up with correspondence back and forth with the Army Boards of Review, still insisting I need to send those forms. And I also need to be next of kin. I asked them, what is the other box for? What was that for? Why was that? I needed to check that off. They never gave me an answer. The following slide is basically the same response that I have received with each correspondence, stating that I cannot supply these forms, nor have I been able to locate the next of kin. And this is the reply that I receive with each correspondence. So I contacted Congressman Paul Tonko for help. He introduced Bill H.R. 6308 into the U.S. House of Representatives on July 3, 2019. This bill would allow the waiver of required forms such as marriage certificates and so forth that can't be provided due to the age of the incident. Well, it went before the Subcommittee on Military Personnel, where it died. This is the text of H.R. 6308. Note, there is an update. I was informed the plan is for Congressman Tonko to reintroduce the bill for this year's House on 2020. For Private Samuel Helms is to be continued. Thank you for watching this program.